A sense of worth comes with self-compassion, but it's not from like being a good person or succeeding or achieving. It's just from being a flawed human being worthy of kindness like everyone else. And so it's a much more stable sense of self-worth. It's a much more stable sense of self-worth. It doesn't require social comparison. You just have to be a flawed human being like everyone else. I can do that, right?
That's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it doesn't have the downsides of self-esteem, and yet it also gives you that sense of self-worth and support.
Welcome to Empowered Kids TV, where we introduce you to the people and ideas to help you take action to create the family of your dreams. Today's guest followed the drive of her own personal pain into the post-doctoral research program to find her freedom. An associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, she has been credited with conducting the first academic studies into self-compassion. A pioneer, author, and speaker, our guest's work has been featured extensively across the globe, including the New York Times, mindful.org, Impact Theory, just to name a few. What I love about our guest is her determination to help us push past the critical voice in our heads that most of us never even acknowledge, but live with each day. Her work has the power to liberate you from the hold of judgment, freeing you to find new levels of self-soothing and compassion, and along the way create an open-heartedness that can foster unconditional love for yourself and for others. So please, help me to welcome a woman who used self-compassion to find the path to true unconditional love for her autistic son, and is determined to empower us with greater resilience, confidence, and compassion by teaching us all how to be more loving to ourselves. The incredible Kristin Neff. Kristin, welcome to Empowered Kids TV.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. It's great to finally connect with you. Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to start just at the base level in terms of really getting a solid understanding of what is self-compassion.
Right. So self-compassion, we're more familiar with compassion for others. We know how that feels. So it's when you feel with someone else in their suffering. The word compassion in the Latin, actually, passion means to suffer, come means with. So there's like an inherent connectedness in compassion. And so self-compassion is just having that same stance toward us. So we become aware that we're struggling as opposed to just like soldiering on. We feel connected in our struggles. This is very important because oftentimes when we make a mistake or something difficult happens, we feel like everyone else in the world is living a perfect life and it's just me who's failed or just me who's having this issue. So again, we're connected in it. We remember that this is part of life. This is part of being human. And then we give ourselves the same type of kindness and support that we would more naturally show to a good friend or someone we cared about. So it's really not rocket science. The only thing is that most people forget to be compassionate to themselves. They know they're supposed to be compassionate to others. And somehow we've gotten it into our heads as a culture that, self-criticism is good, even though the research shows it doesn't help you at all. So it's really just being a good supportive friend to yourself.
Let's talk about some myths, because there are a few myths around self-compassion where people could feel that makes me kind of soft.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of the top myths and see if we can debunk a few of them.
Yeah. So, and luckily now there's tons of research debunking all these myths. So a big one is that it makes you soft, it makes you weak. It's actually just the opposite, right? So when things get tough, you want self-compassion by your side. So, it's like when you go into battle, do you want an enemy in your head cutting you down, shaming you, saying you can't do it, you're lame? Or do you want a friend like support, an ally saying, I got your back, I'm here for you? Obviously, when we go into tough situations, we're going to be stronger when we support ourselves. And again, this is backed up by the research. For instance, there's been a lot of research with combat veterans that shows that those combat veterans that come back from, overseas, Iraq or Afghanistan, who are more self-compassionate about what they experienced, they're less likely to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome, they're less likely to commit suicide or try to commit suicide, they're less likely to turn to alcohol as a way to cope with their pain. So they're actually stronger and more resilient. And that's true in a lot of different areas of life, you know, dealing with divorce, dealing with raising a special needs kid, dealing with cancer. So when things are difficult, if you support yourself, if you're there for yourself, if you're kind to yourself, you're going to be stronger and more able to get through.
Oh, I love it. You also talk about one of the myths as self-compassion can seem to be overindulgent.
Yes.
Like you're so focused on yourself. Can we touch on that one?
Yeah. Well, sometimes people think self-compassion means like being nice to yourself, like giving yourself a break. You know, and sometimes what you need is a break, but sometimes what you need is to get off the couch and do something, right? So when you care about yourself and you want your own well-being and you want to help alleviate your own suffering, which is really what compassion is, you know, sometimes it means working hard. So for instance, people who are more self-compassionate, they do things that maybe aren't pleasant, but it's good for their long-term health, like practicing safe sex or going to the doctor or eating right or exercising, right? So it's not, if you just give yourself pleasure, if you're just soft on yourself, you actually aren't being kind to yourself. Like an indulgent parent is not a compassionate parent. A compassionate parent, you know, doesn't scream at their kids, but also make sure that their child is healthy. And the same thing with ourselves. And then this idea that it's selfish, right? So really, if you look at self-criticism or shame, those are really self-focused emotions. When you're hanging your head in shame, you aren't really thinking about other people. You're completely absorbed inward. When you remember that, hey, everyone makes mistakes. You know, life is difficult for everyone. Then it actually allows you to be less self-focused and you've got more resources to give to other people. So again, it's the exact opposite. Self-compassion helps you have better relationships with others. People, for instance, people are more happy with when their romantic partner is self-compassionate. They judge them more positively because when you have a self-compassionate partner, they're meeting some of their own needs. They aren't like totally depending on you, which means that they actually have more resources to give to you. So self-compassion actually helps and give to others.
That's beautiful. I think there's so much of the work on self-compassion that's really about quieting that critical voice that we all have in our heads. And I
Yes.
wanted to ask, from your research, have you found that people are mostly aware of that voice, or do we kind of operate where that voice happens in the background and we're sometimes unaware of the impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think it differs. Some people are really aware of their self-critical voice, and like they said, if you know, like the devil that sits on their shoulder, and they have this contentious fight with their self-critic. Other people, it's just like in background noise, and they don't even notice it. But the thing is, it's important. It's not like we're trying to get rid of our inner critic or even to quiet it. We're trying to say, okay, what do you have to tell me? Because often the self-critic has useful information, like, hey, that's really not working out so well. You maybe you should leave that relationship or whatever it happens to be, right? So we want to listen to our inner critic, but we just want to like kind of understand, okay, this is trying to keep me safe. But then we want to try to help ourselves be safe by another voice, and that's a compassionate voice, right? So it's like we don't want to beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up. You know, again, we do it because we want to be safe, we want to be healthy. It's just not very effective. So we make space for another more kind of kind, supportive voice that also, they usually have the same goal. Our inner critic and our inner compassionate self, they both want us to be well and to be safe, but just one's more effective than the other. So we're kind of, you know, we're like making space for this other voice as opposed to quieting one, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think sometimes when I look, especially at the self-esteem movement that we had, there's a lot of people that came out of that movement thinking, I have to be a positive thinker, I have to be an optimistic, and sometimes that has, I think, made them ignore the fact that there's that critical voice rather than paying attention to it.
Yes, exactly, right. So they either try to drown it out or they ignore it, or, you know, for instance, the research on positive affirmations, like, you know, I'm going to be able to do it, or I'm great, or I'm strong. It actually helps if you already have high self-esteem, but if you have low self-esteem, it makes it worse. Because it's like, that's not true. Part of you saying, that's not true, that's not true. So it actually makes it worse and sets up internal conflict. So self-compassion is not like self-esteem. So you know, it's good to have high self-esteem as opposed to low self-esteem if you can, right? but the sense of self-worth that comes from high self-esteem, that comes from judging yourself positively, like I'm good at this, I'm, pretty, I'm smart, people love me. It's only there for us in the good times, but when we feel insecure or we get rejected or we fail at something, it deserts us. So it's unstable. It also tends to be comparative. Like how smart or pretty or popular I think I am is always in comparison to you or someone else. And that sets up a really unhealthy social dynamic. We're trying to like put other people down so we can feel good about ourselves. So self-compassion, a sense of worth comes with self-compassion, but it's not from like being a good person or succeeding or achieving. It's just from being a flawed human being worthy of kindness like everyone else. And so it's a much more stable sense of self-worth. It's a much more stable sense of self-worth. It doesn't require social comparison. You just have to be a flawed human being like everyone else. I can do that, right?
That's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it doesn't have the downsides of self-esteem, and yet it also gives you that sense of self-worth and support.
What about, are there habits or maybe behavior traits that we can try to recognize in ourselves if we feel like we're not as aware as we'd like to be of that critical voice, but maybe we can identify some behavior traits within ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, so, the real key is how do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with pain, right? So if you're someone who has a very difficult time, maybe if you get any negative feedback, or if you have a really difficult time dealing with stressful situations, it may be a clue that maybe what's happening is you're making it worse by beating yourself up, right? So a lot of it is just kind of how's your state of mind normally? How happy are you? If you're depressed, self-criticism is one of the major causes of depression. So if you're depressed, it's a good sign that you're self-critical. And sometimes, again, when you're depressed, you don't even know it because you're so down. So that might be a place to investigate. So really, the core of self-compassion is mindfulness. And people have heard a lot about mindfulness, just being aware of what's happening in the present moment. And we need to be mindful of the fact that we're struggling in order to have self-compassion. So, some awareness is necessary. And in fact, that's often the biggest block because we just aren't even aware. But if once you become somewhat aware, you can like write yourself reminder notes, try to be a good friend. What I say to a good friend in this instance, and then you can think, would I say that? Oh no, I wouldn't say that. So there's things you can do to help remind yourself. Again, the good news is it's not that difficult. It's not rocket science, right? Because we already know how to do it. If we have good friendships, we know how to be supportive. We know how to be warm. We know how to be caring. If we have people we care about in our lives, we've already learned the skill of being compassionate to others. And so the big thing is just really remembering, not only remembering, but giving yourself permission to be that way with yourself. And so the permission comes from knowing that it's not going to do all these things you're afraid it's going to do. It's not going to make you weak or lazy or self-indulgence or self-pitying. But also a sense of worthiness, right? So some people were kind of, from their early childhood, were taught that they weren't very valuable or important. And so you kind of have to give yourself the sense of worthiness that maybe you didn't get from your parents. Yeah. But you can actually do that with self-compassion, in part by being kind to yourself because of the pain of not having had that history, right? So you can kind of start where you are, no matter how broken you are. You can hold that brokenness with kindness and a sense of connection, and then you're starting to turn it around.
When I first stumbled across your work a few years ago, I became intentional about listening to my inner voice for the first time in my life. I think I just kind of carried along and there were voices, and I just thought if there were a lot of voices, that's probably mean I was going insane, so don't pay too much attention to all of them. But that's when, for the first time, I realized that I wasn't always as kind to myself as I would be to a friend. And what I found over the few years as I leaned deeper into a practice of self-compassion was that somehow I became stronger, a little bit more resilient than I was before. So I wanted to kind of touch on the link between self-compassion and resilience.
Yeah. So it's a very strong link again, and there's a lot of research around it as well. So it's really what you do when things are tough, when you're under a lot of stress or COVID happens or a pandemic, right? So how do you relate to yourself when things are really tough? And again, the more you can be supportive to yourself, the more you can kind of assure yourself of your own presence. It's kind of weird, like, you know, maybe your parent, maybe your father left you. My father left me when I was young, you know. So we can't control whether or not other people leave us. That just, you know, but we can control whether or not we leave ourselves, right? And so by having our self-compassion practice, like we're always this constant sense of support for ourselves. You know, our own awareness never leaves. We forget about it, but it's always there, you know, and our own love as well is always, you know, there for the taking if we can access it. That's the thing. When we cut ourselves off from it, when we get lost in the storyline of this is so terrible or I'm so terrible, it's like we cut ourselves off from this support that's just right there under our noses, which is self-compassion, you know. And the way, and you know, some people need to work with the therapist to help access it, because if the blocks are really big, you know, maybe you were abused as a child, or you know, maybe you had a lot of trauma, those blocks are going to be more challenging. The research shows they can be worked through, but it may be a little slower, you know, and you may need a little help. It may be a little more destabilizing as you do it, but it absolutely can be done. Because the cool thing about self-compassion is you don't have to like earn it. It's something you've got to achieve. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to like reach some bar to be self-compassionate. The only thing you have to be is a flawed human being to be worthy of self-compassion. And everyone can pass that bar. They may not realize it, but everyone can pass that bar. You know, even people who've done horrible things can pass that bar. You know, compassion encompasses all human beings who suffer. You don't have to like apply for an application to God and say, God, I like this. Can I please get back to me? You know.
Love that you talk about the fact that sometimes there needs to be a recognition that if we've got some major trauma that we're walking through life with, that we need support. But for most of us, and I firmly believe that in our homes as parents, we really get to teach the things that we learn how to model.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So if we had to try to develop some habits and some practices around self-compassion so that we can begin modeling that in our family, where do we start?
Right. So, well, in terms of specific practices, I mean, there are materials available. Like I have a workbook out with lots of practices and stuff. But yeah, so again, the research shows that if someone models self-compassionate, then we tend to be more self-compassionate. Right. So again, it's like one of those things like, oh yeah, I guess I can try that. I can do that. And so for parents, model, so let's say you break a glass, right? There's two ways you can react. One is like, oh, I'm so stupid. You know, and part of us, when we do that, we're kind of hoping people say, oh, no, you aren't. We're wanting compassion for them. But if you did it with your kids, what the kid is learning is, okay, when I drop a glass and shatters, I'm supposed to say I'm so stupid, and that's a good thing. So you can model, oh man, oh no, I'm so sad. I really like that glass, or that's a pain. Oh well, it's only human. You know, it happens. You know, it's okay. Let me clean it up, and you know. So if you model, first of all, acceptance of human fallibility, warmth and support, but also like when you break the glass, you don't just like, oh well, let the shards stay there. You also clean it up, right? And you're going to clean it up by the way, but you can either clean it up while saying I'm such a stupid idiot, or you can clean it up saying, well, I'm only human, it happens. You know, maybe I need to pay more attention or be more careful, or you know, there may be something you can, you know, breaking glass is probably not much you can learn from it. But oftentimes when we fail, you know, it's truism, but it's true. Failure is our best teacher. And so when we fail or make a mistake, if we actually with compassion say, okay, well, what can I learn from this so that I do better next time? You know, that's one of the primary ways we learn. We don't learn from being perfect, you know? And so you can model that learning from failure in front of your kids. And that's a great thing to model. Also, the thing with kids is, you know, all people are connected empathetically, but especially parents or kids and kids. We can kind of intuit what our kids are feeling. We're connected to them emotionally, and they're also really connected to us, right? And so if you're just beating yourself up, or you're really frustrated, or you're full of shame, your kids can pick up on that. You know, you're interacting with them full of shame and self-hate. And, you know, even if you don't say anything on the outside, and by the way, I don't say this like to shame parents, but just to think about it in terms of, you know, it's not like the way you treat yourself is unrelated to your kid. We owe us, like, just how our kids' behavior impacts us, our behavior impacts them. And so if we're compassionate to them and also to us, right, if we're compassionate to ourselves, they can feel it too. They empathically resonate with someone who's more loving, who's more peaceful, who's feeling kind inside. And so you actually help them to resonate with your more positive mind state. And plus, it also gives you more resources to help give to them. So it's really one of the best things you can do for your kids is to be self-compassionate.
I love that point. So I'm going to share something that happened to me recently, and it was like, it took me back a little bit because it was a setting where the recognition of how especially mothers view themselves and their role within the family, it was so much in my face that it took me back. So during COVID, I joined a fitness group, and it was holistic fitness. And we meet up once a week for accountability and kind of share our stories. And as we started, quite quickly started to get all of the excuses. I didn't have enough time. I had to do these with the kids, right? And so we called out that these are excuses. Like, you made time to feed your kids, so why not making time to take care of yourself? And I think, and then there were some moms were actually saying like, I couldn't take time for self-care because it would disrupt my family.
Right.
And I thought when you talk about the fact that the way you even have that internal talk that your kids pick up on that. Yeah. I just wanted to touch on that point that sometimes moms feel by prioritizing everybody else and putting themselves last, like somehow that's doing the best for their family without recognizing that they're teaching their kids how to value each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so self-care is part of self-compassion, but self-compassion is much broader. So self-care means you do something, and it usually like takes extra time out of your day. You may not have time for self-care. You probably do have more time than you think you do, but you may not have a lot of time. But self-compassion, for instance, just being with the pain of not having time for self-care if you're really busy, you can practice self-compassion about being so busy, and you can actually model that for your kids. So self-compassion takes no time, right? It's just a way of relating to what's already happening when what's happening is painful or difficult or stressful, right? And then usually you find that when you do have more compassion toward yourself, you're more willing to find the time because you care. Right? And you aren't guilting yourself and you aren't stressing yourself about it. But really the two, they're overlapping, but they aren't the same. As, you know, self-compassion takes no time. It's just the way you relate to what's already happening. Yeah, I love it. I want to talk a bit about self-compassion as it relates to learning to love unconditionally. Yes. And really being able to accept the people in our lives for who they are. And I was wondering if you'd share a little bit about your own parenting journey and how you had to use compassion to get to that place. Yeah. So, you know, I think you mentioned my son is autistic. I think I mentioned it as well. You know, and by the way, I have to say, I'm so lucky now. Like, he's 18. He is just a dream. He does the dishes without being asked. He's like, doesn't complain. He doesn't backtalk. Like, compared to my parents with neurotypical kids, I've got it much better. So I have nothing to complain about now. But when he was younger, he was much more of a handful. His autism was much more severe, and you know, he'd tantrum, and he wasn't potty trained until he was 5, and all these things. And so what I found was that the more I could accept my own grief, my own disappointment, my own frustration, right, my own feelings, my own difficult feelings about being, you know, having to parent. Having this aspect of my parenting, you know, it actually did allow me to accept him more, right? So very, very much, the more I could just be with what is, with kindness, and, you know, be there for myself, and it could hold my grief, then the more mental and emotional space I had to accept him unconditionally, right? So they really do help each other. And by the way, so like unconditional self-acceptance, there's like a there's a yin and a yang to self-compassion. So the yin is like the unconditional acceptance. We might, for someone else, unconditionally accept them and love them as they are. Ourselves, we unconditionally accept and love ourselves as we are. But sometimes people confuse acceptance with passivity, right? So maybe your kid or one of your family members, you might accept them, but maybe they're doing behavior that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. Sometimes we need to say, hey, you got to make a change. This isn't okay. We need to draw boundaries. You know, as parents, we need to set rules up, right? We need to say what's okay. You can have boundaries with your kid while you love them unconditionally, but being passive is not being very good to them. They need boundaries. We need boundaries, right? And people get a little confused about that. So we can emotionally accept someone else and ourselves at the same time that we can say, you know, I'm sorry, this is what I need. This is the behavior I need. And if you can't give it to me, I'm not going to hate you, but there's going to be some sort of consequence, right? So
I love that. If you had to say to us, take this one thing and try it out for the next month so that you can try to build your self-compassion, what would that one thing be?
So a very easy thing is, so the trigger is going to be any sort of pain, any sort of like difficult emotion. It could be confusion, frustration, sadness, whatever it is. So that's your mindfulness now.
Easy at this time.
Oh yeah, any sort of pain. And then so just think, and then notice how you're reacting in relation to that pain. And just ask yourself, what would I say to a friend I really cared about who was going through the exact same situation? What would I naturally say? If a friend were to call me and say, you know, hey, you know, Nicole, this is what's happening in my life, what would you naturally say to that friend? And then just try it on with yourself in the same tone of voice, right? So the same kind of warm, supportive tone. You can, even if you want, put a hand can be very good for kind of feeling your own presence. So, you know, we can't touch our friends right now because of COVID. We can't touch yourselves, you know, don't touch your face. You can touch yourself, you know, and just say, you know, and just try it out. Put your hand on somewhere, just supportive, and just try saying to yourself what you would say to a friend, and see, look for yourself, the impact it has on you. Remember, you aren't like giving yourself a bunch of BS. You aren't saying everything's fine. Maybe it's not fine, you know, but you can say, I'm here for you. You know, I won't abandon you. I'm so sorry this is so difficult. You know, I care. Those types of things you can say, and they really do make a big difference.
I love it. Before I ask my last question, tell all of yours where we can find out more about your work.
Yeah, so very easy, one-stop shopping is selfcompassion.org. If you Google self-compassion, you'll find it. And so I have a lot of free resources. You can test your own self-compassion level with the scale I created. We've got a ton of research, actually the PDFs of the research articles. I have guided meditations, I have exercises, and then there's links if you want some more in-depth training. There's links to the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. You can take online training if you want to go deeper. But you don't, you know, before you take that step, you can just do a few of the practices. Like I have a practice called Self-Compassion for Caregivers. It's a video YouTube thing. It's about 7 minutes. You can try that out, and it's really good for parents, and see how you like it.
Beautiful. Okay, so my last question, what does it mean to you to live an empowered life?
Well, so I'm actually really into empowerment lately, especially female empowerment. This is the yang side of self-compassion, right? And so self-compassion is empowering, right? When we stop beating ourselves up, pulling the rug out underneath from under us, when we stop, like, you know, just subordinating our own needs to those of others, and we can start to claim our power, right? And so for me, claiming my power is, you know, work fulfillment. I've got passion in my work. I'm very lucky. I've got a calling in life. So that's empowering. But I'm also really interested in helping to empower other women. For instance, the fact that women can't get angry. You know, anger is a powerful emotion. The fact that we can't get angry is a problem. Now, we don't want to have the yang anger without any yin. If we have anger without any compassion, then we're just like aggressive. We don't want that. But we can claim our power. We can, you know, take our place. We can say no. We can draw boundaries. We can say, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable what you just said, or whatever it is. that's an act of compassion. That's very empowering. So my new book is called Fierce Self-Compassion. It won't be out until next year, but it's all about female empowerment. So
Can't wait.
yeah.
Oh, Kristin, thank you so much for joining us and for all
You're
your work.
welcome.
I think the basis of it, from my own experience, was helping me learn to be kinder and to love myself more. And then I have more to give away. So thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. Lovely to talk to you, Nicole.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We're all about sharing and supporting this village. So if you found value in this episode, be sure to share it with your family and friends. And remember, this is a weekly show. So if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you'll be notified of our next episode. As we always say in the village, you're just one connection away. With love and gratitude, empower us. Until next time.